This is a reading of Shipwreck at the Bottom of the World by Jennifer Armstrong. And this chapter is called Mutiny. One of the most infamous stories of polar exploration is Sir John Franklin's doomed search of the Northwest Passage. In 1845, Franklin took two Royal Navy ships, Erebus and Terror, and a crew of 129 into the Arctic to search for a sea route between North Atlantic and the Pacific. They never returned. Years later, a record of the fateful voyage was discovered among some artifacts in Arctic Canada. Mutiny, insanity, desertion, cannibalism, dreadful things were whispered about the members of the Franklin expedition. More than 40 rescue missions were sent from England, at least 10 of them financed by Lady Franklin, the leader's widow. A book of one of Lady Franklin's rescue missions, The Voyage of the Fox, was among the non-essential stores and equipment left behind at Ocean Camp. The essentials were now being dragged laboriously over the ice by Endurance's crew. Far to their west on the Arctic Peninsula was Erebus and Terror Gulf, named in honor of the two ships that had navigated to the bottom of the world before being lost at the top. Without doubt, Shackleton's men were well versed in stories about the Franklin voyage and well aware of the dangers that faced them as they man-hauled two of the boats over the rotting ice toward a very uncertain goal. Shackleton had hoped by setting out across the ice to enliven the crew and focus their minds on action. Instead, he found himself faced with growing resentment and dissatisfaction. Now that the Endurance was gone, some of the fossils' hands were grumbling that they were working without pay and no longer bound to follow Shackleton's orders. In addition, Worsley was constantly fretting about the boats. Shackleton had decided to leave one of them with Stancomb Wills behind at Ocean Camp, but Worsley knew that cramming the whole crew into the James Connard and the Dudley Docker once they reached the open ocean would be difficult, if not impossible. The two boats would ride low and heavy in the water, and maneuvering them would take all their skill. But to drag all three boats, Shackleton knew that was impossible. As it was, the men hauling the Card and the Docker were sinking up to their knees in slush, and their boats were filling with 7 pounds of freezing water with each step. They marched that night when the surface of the pack was slightly cooler and harder, but even so, the labor was horrendous. Again, they relayed one boat at a time in quarter-mile stages, trudging back over their own tracks to bring up the second boat. Often by the time they reached the second boat, they would find the runners of the sledge frozen into the ice, and they would have to lunge forward 3 or 4 times like exhausted draft horses to snap it free. The dog teams broke the trail as much as possible, but in 3 days they covered only 7 miles. They would certainly have traveled much faster and easier without the boats, but without the boats, they hadn't a chance. They would eventually reach the edge of the pack and have the ocean in front of them. They had to take the boats. On December 27th, Shackleton turned back from breaking trail to find that the men hauling the boats were standing idle. Soaking with sweat and seawater, the crew shuffled their feet in the snow, looking anxious and avoiding Shackleton's eyes. Overhead, a lone patrol circled, watching the scene. Worsley, angry and exasperated, was in a standoff with a mulish, silent McNish. The carpenter had decided not to take another step. Under naval law, the ship's crew is free of obligation when the ship sinks. Their duties are terminated and their pay ceases. After years at sea, McNeish knew his naval laws, and he was convinced that the Endurance ship's articles were canceled. He wasn't going to follow orders from Worsley or Shackleton or anyone else any longer. He had had enough. This was the first threat to Shackleton's command, but it was a potentially disastrous one. Chances for survival were slim at best if they all stayed together. But if the crew broke apart and chose their own courses, their chances would dwindle to nothing. At the moment, nobody was siding with McNeish. After all, staying behind was obviously fatal. But Shackleton knew how close his crew was to falling apart. The forecastle hands, along with McNeish, had begun grumbling about their duties and pay since the ship sank. And some of the university men who were unused to such a hard life were so demoralized by the events of the last month that they seemed ready to break down. Once a man sat down on the ice and decided to continue, it would require force or threats of violence to get him moving again. Shackleton returned to the sledge that carried the ship's crew list. Paper in hand, in a quiet, steady voice, he read the ship's articles, which each man had signed before leaving England. They had been modified slightly from the usual contract. All the members of the crew, without exception, to have interchangeable duties. The crew agrees to conduct themselves in an orderly, faithful, honest, and sober manner, and to be at all times diligent in their respective duties, and to be obedient to the lawful commands of the said master, whether on board in boats or on shore. Shackleton was the master, and technically they were now on shore. Disobedience to the commands of the master was legally punishable. The ship's articles had not been terminated, and neither had the crew's pay. As the sailors' discontent subsided, Shackleton took McNeish aside and exchanged a few quiet words with him, perhaps reminding him that execution was a legal punishment for mutiny. After a short rest, the men wearily harnessed themselves to the boat once more, and McNeish took his place with the others. The exhausted bands of sled crept over the ice through another night, covering only 2.5 miles. The way grew increasingly difficult. The ice was so thin in some places that the heavy lifeboats cracked the floes and formed leads of salt water. Bergs and broken floes were jumbled together between increasingly large leads of open water. Progress in any direction began to look impossible. The next day, they retreated to a large old floe that seemed solid, and there they pitched camp, but they soon discovered it was not as secure as they hoped. They could not go forward. The way back to Ocean Camp was impassable. The ice was too soft to cross, but there was not enough open water to launch the boats. They moved a short distance again, and then one more time. At last, they made a new camp, and it appeared they had abandoned Ocean Camp for no advantage at all. Their new floe was smaller and less stable. They had left behind many things they had salvaged from Endurance, including scrap lumber that had made dry floors for their flimsy canvas tents. They were stuck where they were, and the ice pack was crumbling to pieces beneath them. On December 31st, 1915, Shackleton wrote in his diary, "The last day of the old year. May the new one bring us good fortune, a safe deliverance from this anxious time, and all good things to those we love so far away." If their loved ones so far away could have seen the crew of the Endurance, their hearts would have been broken. Nothing could have been more pitiful and hopeless than 28 men marooned on a rotting ice pack nearly 200 miles from the nearest solid land. They called their new home Patience Camp.